Over northern France, February 1944. The sky is a frozen cage of steel and vapor. At 25,000 feet, a B-17 Flying Fortress hums under strain, its engines trembling against the bitter cold. The crew speaks in short breaths, oxygen masks frosting with every exhale. Deep below the bomb bay, in a glass sphere no wider than a kitchen table, a man is curled into a position no human body was meant to hold. He is 19, maybe 18. His knees are tucked under his chest, his back arched, his hands trembling on two .50 caliber Browning machine guns. The ball turret hangs beneath the bomber like a planet orbiting a world of aluminum and fear. He can't stand. He can't turn around. He can't escape unless the landing gear is lowered, and in battle, that rarely happens. A shadow slices across the clouds. A German FW-190 rolls into attack, engine screaming, guns already spitting fire. The ball turret gunner breathes once. He cannot look away. He cannot run. He is the first to see death coming, and the last line of defense keeping it away. This is why the ball turret became the most feared position in the sky. When the United States entered the European Air War in 1942, its commanders carried a bold conviction that daylight precision bombing could cripple Nazi industry and shorten the war. The 8th Air Force built its strategy around the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, twin symbols of American industrial power. These bombers flew high, flew far, and carried enough defensive firepower to protect themselves without fighter escort, at least in theory. But the skies over occupied Europe did not forgive theory. At altitude, the air thinned to glass, temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero, and the Luftwaffe, hardened by years of combat, waited. German fighter doctrine revolved around fast, diving attacks from below. The underside of a bomber was its blind spot, a broad, exposed surface with no natural defense. Pilots flying Bf-109s and FW-190s learned to come up under the formation, fire into the belly, and peel away before the American gunners could even react. The U.S. Army Air Forces needed a solution, something compact, agile, and deadly enough to cover the one angle every bomber feared most. The answer came in the form of a spherical turret designed by the Sperry Corporation, a glass and metal orb that rotated a full 360 degrees, allowing a gunner to shoot in nearly any direction. The engineers called it the Sperry Type A ball turret, but to use it, a man would have to climb inside. The turret was suspended from the bomber's belly like a hanging lantern. No armor plating, no room to move, no escape hatch. Its diameter was just over 4 feet. The gunner sat curled inside, knees drawn tight, chin near his chest, feet fixed in stirrups that controlled elevation. He aimed with a small reflector sight. He fired twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns, weapons capable of tearing through aluminum, fuel lines, and engines at hundreds of yards. From the outside, it appeared mechanical. From the inside, it was deeply personal. A bomber carried 10 men, but the ball turret gunner was alone, physically separated from the crew, held inside a sealed world of plexiglass and steel. The others could talk, move, shift position, trade glances. The gunner could not. He listened to the crew through a headset, but the voices felt miles away. Even oxygen was a reminder of vulnerability. If the line failed, he had minutes, sometimes only seconds. The position demanded the smallest man in the crew, usually someone barely out of high school. Many were 17, 18, 19. They had enlisted quickly, trained briefly, and now found themselves suspended between earth and sky, holding the fate of the bomber's belly in their hands. The logic was simple. If the underside of the formation held, the bomber stream survived. If it broke, the entire mission failed, men, machines, and objective. And the Luftwaffe knew it. German pilots spoke of the ball turret with respect, bordering on caution. They called it das hangende Egg, the hanging egg. They had learned the hard way that even a single well-trained gunner could shred a climbing fighter before it fired a shot. But the danger to the gunner himself was constant. Flak bursts below the formation sent shrapnel upward. A hit to the turret could jam it mid-rotation. If the landing gear failed upon return, the turret might be crushed against the runway, with the gunner still inside. There were times crews had to choose, save the plane or save the man in the turret. It became one of the war's quiet tragedies, seldom spoken, never forgotten. Yet men continued to volunteer for it. Some said it was pride. Some said it was duty. Others said it was because, for a moment, inside the glass sphere, they felt a strange kind of clarity. No distractions, no confusion, only the target and the sky. The ball turret was not just another component of the bomber. It was a position where fear and courage existed in their purest form, suspended beneath aluminum wings over hostile territory. And to understand the full weight of that experience, we must look not only at the machine, but at the men chosen to occupy it.
The men chosen for the ball turret were not selected by rank or seniority. They were chosen by size. In the training barracks at Texas, Colorado, and Nebraska, instructors measured shoulders, chest width, and leg length with quiet efficiency. The position demanded compact bodies. Most ball turret gunners weighed between 115 and 145 pounds. Many barely passed adolescence. Some volunteered. Many did not. Yet once assigned, they trained with a focus few other crew members matched. Gunnery school began with fundamentals, weapon maintenance, jam clearing, ammunition belt feeding, sighting technique. But the real trial came when they entered a mock turret for the first time, a steel sphere mounted close to the ground. The instructors locked the hatch, rotated the turret, and let the silence settle. Some men lasted minutes before panic rose. A few lasted seconds. Claustrophobia was not a disqualifier on paper, but it was in reality. Those who couldn't master their breathing were reassigned. Those who stayed learned the rhythm of the sphere. The stirrups under their feet controlled elevation. Hand grips controlled traverse. They learned to fire short, controlled bursts, no more than 2 seconds at a time, to prevent overheating. They memorized the sound of misfeeds and the feel of jammed links, and they learned to calculate deflection, to anticipate where a fast-moving fighter would be by the time the bullet reached it. The turret was not a place for hesitation. It was a place where fractions of seconds meant life or death. But no amount of training could prepare a man for the first mission over Europe. The cold struck first. At altitude, even with electrically heated suits, gloves, and boots, temperatures plunged so low that steel frosted to bare skin instantly. A gunner could not afford to remove his gloves. Touching the metal inside the turret could strip skin away. Oxygen flowed through narrow hoses into a face mask that had to remain sealed. If the mask slipped, if the line iced, if the regulator failed, hypoxia crept in silently. Confusion, dizziness, fading consciousness. Sight was limited to what the curved glass allowed. Outside, the earth was a distant, unmoving tapestry. Inside, the turret felt like a world of one. The intercom connected the gunner to the crew, but the voices sounded distant, muted by engine roar and the insulation of isolation. The bomber group flew in tight formation, dozens of aircraft layered in defensive arrangement, but the ball turret gunner experienced none of that cohesion. He was alone, suspended beneath thousands of pounds of aircraft, held in place by hydraulics and a thin metal ring. And he was always the first to see the enemy. German fighters often approached from the below, climbing with speed to rake fire across the bomber's vulnerable underbelly before peeling away. The ball turret gunner's role was to stop the attack before it started. If he failed, the waist gunners and tail gunner would be overwhelmed. The success of the turret was measured not just in kills, but in the attacks that never reached the bomber in the first place. Yet the danger to the gunner himself was constant and immediate. Flak bursts from German anti-aircraft guns sent razor shots of steel upward. A single fragment could shatter the turret's glass, sever hydraulic lines, or jam rotation. A jammed turret was a death sentence during landing. Landings required the turret to be retracted into the fuselage. If the mechanism failed, the turret remained extended. The pilot faced an impossible choice: attempt a wheels-up landing and crush the gunner, or order him to remain inside while the crew bailed out and the bomber was abandoned over enemy territory. There were crews who never spoke about those decisions after the war. And yet, the ball turret became one of the most respected and feared combat roles in the U.S. Army Air Forces. It demanded calm under pressure, physical endurance, and psychological strength far beyond what most young men had ever needed to find. The turret was not merely a defensive weapon. It was the last line, the thin shield between a bomber's survival and its destruction. And to understand its full significance, we must now examine the position from multiple angles: mechanical, emotional, strategic, and human. Because inside that glass sphere, fear and courage lived side by side without room for anything in between.
From the outside, the ball turret looks like an improbable machine. A steel and glass sphere suspended beneath a bomber, turning smoothly as if weightless. But every component was engineered with a precise purpose: to defend the aircraft where it was most vulnerable. The supporting ring allowed full rotation, providing a 360-degree field of fire, something no other gun position on the bomber could achieve. Mounted inside were two .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, capable of firing over 800 rounds per minute. The guns were set forward, parallel, aligned carefully to converge at a predetermined point in the sky. When the gunner pulled a trigger, the recoil shook the entire sphere, but the stabilizing gyros kept his aim steady enough to track a fighter moving faster than 400 miles per hour. But the genius of the turret was also its greatest flaw: its size. To allow maximum rotation, the interior was so cramped that the gunner could not wear a parachute. Even the flak vest had to stay outside. He curled into a fetal position when entering, lowering himself feet first through the hatch and sliding into the seat suspended between the guns. His knees hugged his chest, his back curved, his face only inches from the glass. In this position, he could only move with the machine. His body and the turret became one weapon: compact, precise, and utterly exposed. Emotionally, the position demanded a mindset somewhere between discipline and detachment. The gunner had to suppress instinctual panic. He had to trust that the bomber would protect him, that the hydraulics would not fail, that the enemy pilots would not target him specifically, though many did. German fighter pilots understood that removing the ball turret meant opening the bomber's belly, and once the belly was open, the bomber was vulnerable everywhere. There are accounts of Messerschmitt Bf-109 pilots diving low and beneath formation, not to destroy the entire aircraft, but to destroy the turret first, snapping its glass with cannon fire and leaving the bomber exposed. Strategically, the turret shifted the balance of air combat. Before its introduction, bomber formations flying without fighter escort suffered devastating losses from low frontal and underside attacks. Enemy pilots exploited blind spots. The ball turret removed the largest blind spot in American bombers,
forcing fighters to approach from more dangerous angles, such as head-on or high-sight sweeps, attacks that demanded higher skill and exposed them to crossfire. The presence of the turret didn't guarantee safety, but it changed the calculus of air combat over Europe and the Pacific. Mechanically, operating the turret was a skill of delicate control. The gunner did not simply point and shoot. He led targets, compensated for bomber airspeed, crosswind, and enemy altitude. He watched tracers arc ahead in space, adjusting based on where the fighter would be, not where it was. The best gunners didn't fire in panic. They fired in mathematical anticipation. They learned the enemy's habits, the preferred dive angles of FW-190s, the corkscrew evasions of BF-109s, the sweeping curves of Japanese Zeros. Experience taught faster than manuals. But for all the strategy and skill, the position remained deeply human. The gunner was not just a part of the machine. He was a young man with a beating heart in a steel coffin. He heard every bullet that struck the fuselage near him. He listened to the roar of engines through the metal frame. He felt every vibration and every shift in the airplane's movement. When flak burst erupted nearby, the shockwaves rattled the turret violently, the fragments scraping across the exterior like gravel thrown against glass. And perhaps most hauntingly, when a bomber went down, the ball turret gunner's fate was almost always sealed. If the aircraft lost power, hydraulic pressure dropped, the turret locked. The hatch could not be opened from inside. The gunner could hear the alarm sirens, the shouts of the crew, the wind ripping past the fuselage, but he could not get out unless someone came to free him. And in the chaos of combat, with fire spreading or the aircraft breaking apart, there was often no time. Yet morale did not break. Veterans described the turret not as a tomb, but as a duty, a job that had to be done to protect the men they trusted with their lives. The bomber was a flying ecosystem. Pilot, navigator, bombardier, waist gunners, radio operator, tail gunner, each position interdependent. If one failed, the aircraft's survival dropped sharply. The turret gunner held the underside, the foundation of the formation. He never saw the faces of the enemy pilots clearly. They were streaks of motion and flashes of canopy glint. But they saw him, the small sphere beneath the bomber, the one man who stood between them and their mission. In that silent acknowledgement, predator and defender, lay the essence of the ball turret's legacy. Not just fear, not just danger, but the understanding that one of the smallest positions on the aircraft carried one of the greatest burdens.
But to understand why the ball turret earned its fearsome reputation, we must shift from design to experience, the raw, unfiltered reality lived by the men who occupied it. In training, new gunners were often eager. They saw the turret as a mark of precision, a role requiring steady nerves and fast reflexes. Many were small, lightweight men, farm boys, baseball players, sons of machinists, chosen because they could fit inside. On paper, the role sounded heroic. In the briefing rooms, instructors spoke of angles of attack, convergence distance, ammunition discipline, and aircraft silhouettes. They ran drills on turret rotation, sight alignment, jam clearing, oxygen line checks. But no training could replicate the first combat flight. When a bomber formation crossed the English Channel into occupied Europe or approached a Japanese-held island in the Pacific, the gunner's world transformed into a suspended battlefield. Below him, the earth looked distant and unreal, like a map more than a place. The sky around him, however, was alive with movement and noise. Contrails crisscrossed. Distant flak bursts grew into black flowers blooming nearer. The engines roared and the fuselage shuddered as the bomber climbed, turned, and held formation. Inside the turret, the gunner's breathing was loud in his headset. The heat from his body fogged the glass until the cold wiped it away in frost. His hands hovered near the triggers, and he scanned, constantly, endlessly, the empty sky. Then the emptiness ended. A flicker of sunlight glinting off metal, a fast-moving silhouette emerging from cloud. German fighters often attacked from below, where gunners in other positions could not easily respond. Japanese Zero pilots used curved climbing approaches, rising under the bomber before looping over its tail. The ball turret gunner saw them first, and sometimes he was the only one who saw them at all. His call over the intercom had to be calm, clear, immediate. "Fighters, 6 o'clock low." That call alone could save the aircraft. But calling them out and stopping them were two different things. The fighter came fast, too fast to simply track like a moving target on a firing range. The gunner led shots ahead, aiming at the space the fighter would occupy seconds later. His tracers stitched across the sky, white arcs cutting space. Sometimes the fighter broke off. Sometimes it didn't. There are accounts of ball turret gunners firing until their barrels glowed red, until the casings piled around their feet, until the guns jammed and they had to reach blindly through cramped metal to clear them. Their bodies were contorted, their muscles strained from the constant motion, and yet they could not stop, not even for a breath. But the true fear, the fear that never left them, came when damage hit the aircraft itself. A single burst of 20mm cannon fire from a Bf-109 could shatter the turret's glass or jam its rotation. Flak shrapnel could sever hydraulic lines. If the turret jammed facing downward, the gunner was trapped with the ground beneath him rushing up at terminal speed. He knew the risk. Every gunner knew the risk. And so did the rest of the crew. Stories survive of entire crews working frantically to free a jammed turret after landing gear failed or after damage froze the mechanism. Men hammered at the hatch with tools. Others used crowbars to force the ring open. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they did not. In these moments, the ball turret gunner was not a heroic symbol of wartime courage. He was simply a human being in the most vulnerable position imaginable, dependent entirely on the aircraft and the men around him. Yet despite all of this, the fear, the isolation, the danger, the turret gunner held a unique power in the skies. When enemy fighters made their final approach, when tracer lines converged and metal screamed through air, the ball turret gunner's fire often made the difference between a bomber returning home or becoming smoke falling through the clouds. Survivors remember a strange mix of terror and precision, of chaos and total focus. They describe the moment of firing as something that dissolved fear into pure clarity, a narrowing of the world into a glass sphere, 2 machine guns, and a streaking enemy aircraft. And it is this contrast, vulnerability, and control that defines the ball turret's legacy in wartime memory. The turret was not feared only because it was dangerous to occupy. It was feared because it demanded everything: composure, trust, marksmanship, endurance, all from the man least protected and most exposed. In the great machinery of war, the ball turret gunner was both the smallest part and the one who held the darkest burden. To watch death rising toward him from the clouds, and to meet it head-on, alone, suspended beneath the sky. The turning point for the ball turret's story came in 1943 and 1944, when the air war over Europe reached a scale and intensity the world had never seen before. By then, bomber formations filled the sky for miles, stretching in tight, layered boxes, hundreds of aircraft forming a single moving fortress of aluminum, fire, and noise. But the Luftwaffe adapted. They learned where the bombers were strong and where they were exposed. They attacked from below, in steep climbing passes. They coordinated mass head-on waves. They introduced rockets, heavier cannon, and armored gun pods specifically designed to break apart bomber formations. It was in this escalating battle that the ball turret gunner became not just another crewman, but often the deciding factor between survival and disaster. On missions deep into Germany, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Ploiest, Bremen, the ball turret gunner's voice became the early warning system. His field of vision provided a warning that no radar and no command briefing could replace. When the intercom crackled with his call, short, fast, urgent, every crew member listened. Fighters low, multiple, closing fast. The bomber tensed as if it were a living being.
Engines strained, gunners shifted. The pilot held formation while every instinct told him to break away. And below the crew, in that glass sphere, the youngest man on board prepared to fight alone. Enemy fighters approached with frightening speed, 350 to 400 miles per hour, while the bomber crawled through the air at nearly half that. At closing distance, the fight was decided in seconds. The gunner's hands gripped the butterfly triggers, his feet worked the turret pedals, his eyes tracked the enemy's movement, trying to stay ahead of its arc. Every shot had to be intentional, every burst had to count. And something else had changed by 1944. The enemies he faced were no longer simply pilots protecting their skies. Many were veterans hardened by years of combat. Luftwaffe Experten, aces with 50, 80, sometimes 100 confirmed kills. Men who knew how to exploit a bomber's blind spot, how to slip between tracer arcs, how to time a climb to avoid the turret's rotation lag. These were not duels of equals. They were contests between experience and desperation. But in the chaos of those battles, the ball turret proved something no one had expected during its design. It could break a fighter attack with a well-aimed burst at exactly the right moment. A single split-second volley, if timed perfectly, could send an attacking fighter spiraling away in flames, forcing the entire formation of enemy aircraft to rethink their approach. Veteran pilots in both the Luftwaffe and the Imperial Japanese Navy later recalled the ball turret specifically. Not the tail gun, not the top turret, but the most dangerous defensive gun in the air. Because it was the only gun that could meet them on their terms. Head-on in a vertical fight where speed, angle, and closing vector converged into a single instant. But that lethality came with an equal and opposite vulnerability. On missions where flak bursts tore through the bomber's aluminum skin like shrapnel through paper, the turret absorbed shock after shock. The glass shook, metal rang like struck bells. The gunner's vision blurred, clarity returning only in breaths. And then, the worst-case scenario, one that haunted every turret gunner from the first mission to the last. Hydraulics hit, rotation stalled, turret locked. He was now facing only one direction. If fighters came from any other angle, he could do nothing. He could only watch. Radio transcripts from returning crews revealed simple phrases that carried unbearable meaning. Ball turret out. The rest of the crew immediately understood what this meant and what it could mean very soon. But even in these moments, the gunner did not always stop fighting. Limited to a single firing line, he tracked any enemy aircraft crossing that narrow arc with a focus sharpened by necessity. His world had shrunk to a tunnel, a single field of movement. But if an enemy entered that space, the gunner struck with the precision of someone who had no room for error. And the bomber, damaged, shuddering, losing altitude, still depended on him. This is where the psychological climax of the role revealed itself, not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet seconds after an attack, when the sky emptied and the bomber continued its long, slow journey home. Inside the turret, the man was alone again, cold returning to his bones, muscles shaking, oxygen mask wet with condensation. He had survived. But the mission was not over. There were hours yet to fly. There were more fighters waiting. And the turret gave him no shelter from the waiting. This moment, stretched between relief and dread, is the heart of why the ball turret became not only feared as a mechanical position, but remembered as a psychological crucible. It required a man to fight hardest when he was most isolated, most exposed, and most aware of what could happen at any turn in the sky. And it is here, in this fragile space between attack and survival, that the final and most decisive battles of the turret gunner's story would unfold.
The final and most defining chapter of the ball turret's legacy was written during the deep penetration raids of 1944, when American bombers flew far beyond the range of fighter escort. These missions were long, punishing and unforgiving, and every mile deeper into German airspace increased the danger. One of the most documented examples came on February 22, 1944, during the series of missions known as Big Week, the Allied air campaign designed to destroy the German aircraft industry. Thousands of bombers filled the sky. Below them, German fighter groups scrambled in waves, determined to break the formations before they reached their targets. It was on missions like these that the ball turret gunner faced the full weight of air combat. The enemy did not come one at a time. They came in packs. Messerschmitts diving from above, Focke-Wulfs sweeping up from below, twin-engine night fighters modified for daytime intercepts firing rockets meant to tear entire bombers apart. The ball turret became the focal point of defense, the one gun position that could break the first wave. Footage and gun camera records show ball turret tracers intersecting fighter attack runs at the exact moment of commit, that instant when the pilot locked into his trajectory and could not alter course. Those bursts, half a second, maybe 1 second, were the difference between life and fire. In these moments, the turret gunner entered a state veterans later described as unreal, narrowed, silent. The noise of the engines vanished. The world became only target, distance, lead, fire. A German pilot attacking a bomber formation understood this as well. Many Luftwaffe memoirs describe a hesitation when closing distance under the belly of a fortress, a brief instant where survival and duty collided. "We called it the eye of the beast," one veteran wrote. "If the gunner saw you, you died." Not always, not often, but often enough to matter. Statistical records from U.S. 8th Air Force damage reports reveal something striking. Ball turret gunners accounted for a disproportionately high percentage of confirmed fighter kills relative to their visibility and crew size. This was not because the turret was comfortable, or easy to use, or safe. It was because the turret gunner had the purest shot in the formation, the cleanest line of fire on the most lethal attack path. But this advantage came with the harshest fate when the bomber suffered critical damage. If the landing gear jammed, the turret might not be able to retract. If the hydraulic system failed, the turret might not rotate. If the bomb bay doors jammed, the gunner could not escape his fear. And so in some landings, crews discovered that the turret could not be freed in time. Other aircraft tried to belly land, sliding across fields or runways while the turret remained extended. Crews and ground personnel recalled these moments with lasting heaviness. Every man in the air war knew the risks, but there was something uniquely human about the turret gunner. He was the one most isolated, the one most physically trapped, the one who depended on everyone else to return home. Yet even knowing all of this, the cramped body position, the cold, the isolation, the mortal danger, men volunteered for the position. Not because it was glorious, not because it was revered, but because it mattered. The ball turret gunner held a role that could save the entire crew, the pilots, the navigator, the radio operator, the waist gunners, the bombardier, the engineer, all of them. In the decisive moments of combat, when a fighter closed to fire range, the ball turret was the last line. It is here in the space between fear and responsibility that the true meaning of the turret emerges. The ball turret was not feared because it was deadly. It was feared because it asked more of a man than almost any other position in the air war. To fight alone, to see what others could not see, and to do what others could not do, and do it suspended between the earth and the sky, enclosed in glass and steel, with no escape but victory
or the long fall below. This is where the climax settles, not in a moment of triumph, but in the quiet depth of what the position demanded and what it cost.
When the air war began to turn in 1944, the legacy of the ball turret started to take shape not in combat reports but in crew recollections. In the quiet moments after missions, when the men stepped off their aircraft and looked back at the place where one of their own had been suspended beneath them. By late 1944, long-range escort fighters, P-51 Mustangs and improved P-47s, now accompanied bombers deep into enemy territory. This changed the rhythm of the air war. Fighter attacks became less constant, flak became more predictable, and the bomber crews began to reach targets with slightly greater odds of survival. But nothing made the ball turrets safer. Even with enemy air forces weakening, the turret remained a position with one of the highest casualty rates in the bomber crew. Yet the men who survived spoke of something that often goes unmentioned: the bond between the ball turret gunner and the rest of the crew. Because the gunner fought alone, the crew watched over him in every way they could. The engineer made sure the turret was warmed before altitude froze its mechanisms. The radio operator monitored the oxygen lines. The pilot checked hydraulic pressure every few minutes. The waist gunners called out threats specifically to support him. If the ball turret gunner went quiet, even for a moment, someone spoke first. "Ball, check in." A simple phrase, but loaded with meaning. It meant, "Are you alive? Are you conscious? Are you breathing? Are you still with us?" And the gunner would answer, always with just one word: "Still here." Those two words became a thread connecting him to the crew above, a reminder that even though his world was made of glass and fear and sky, he was not alone. After the war, many ball turret gunners struggled to explain what their role had felt like. Some spoke little of it at all. Others described the experience in short, focused memories, not full stories, but fragments. The sight of tracers arching toward them in a long, glowing line. The vibration of the turret when the aircraft took flak. The cold, especially the cold. And the silence that followed battle, when adrenaline drained and the body remembered it was still human. One of the most referenced cultural echoes came from a short poem published in 1945 by American poet and B-17 maintenance crewman Randall Jarrell. Titled "The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner," it was only 5 lines long, but it captured what thousands of words could not. "From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from Earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose." It was not a political statement, not an accusation, not glorification. It was simply truth. A truth that was understood instantly by anyone who had served. Yet the turret story does not end in tragedy alone, because history also remembers what these men achieved. U.S. Army Air Force archives list thousands of confirmed enemy aircraft shot down by ball turret gunners, enough to meaningfully reduce the effectiveness of German and Japanese interception tactics. In some bomber groups, turret gunners accounted for 1 in every 3 confirmed kills during their missions. This meant aircraft survived that otherwise would not have. It meant crews returned home who otherwise would not have. It meant missions succeeded that otherwise would have failed, including raids that shaped the final direction of the war. And when bomber crews reassembled on the tarmac after landing, they did something that rarely appears in official documentation, but shows up again and again in surviving crew testimonies. They checked on the ball turret gunner first. Not because he was weakest, but because he carried the weight no one else could fully understand. As the war drew to a close in 1945 and the last missions flew over ruined German cities and empty Japanese skies, the ball turret became something symbolic, a reminder of the cost of air power, the vulnerability hidden inside the machinery of steel and fire. The turret was removed from most bombers within just a few years of the war ending. The age of high-altitude mass formation bombing was over. Jet aircraft and guided missiles rendered the sphere obsolete. But memory held on. Not in museums, though some turrets remain there. Not in film, though Hollywood occasionally recreated them. It remained in the way veterans paused when asked about the turret. In the way pilots and crew spoke of the gunner not as a position, but as a person. One they knew, one they remembered, one they heard breathing in the intercom while the sky raged around them. The aftermath of the ball turret story is not only about technology, casualties, or strategy. It is about the human reality of war. And it leads into the final question the war forced everyone who served inside those aircraft. When the war finally ended in Europe in May 1945, and in the Pacific a few months later, bomber crews returned home to a world that had changed, and yet strangely, did not seem to recognize what they had endured. There were no parades for ball turret gunners, no public honors for the men who had fought suspended between the sky and the earth. They came home quietly, to farms, to factories, to universities funded by the GI Bill, to small towns that looked exactly as they had before the war began. Many did not speak of their role, some because the memories were still sharp, others because they believed no one would understand what it meant to fight alone in a glass sphere, thousands of feet above the ground, with death rising toward them in the shape of a fighter's silhouette. For many, the most lasting mark the turret left was not physical, but psychological. The position demanded an awareness of vulnerability unlike any other in the bomber. A man in the turret could not escape the understanding that a single flak burst, a single jam, a single mechanical failure could seal his fate. Some carried that awareness with them long after the war, in the way they moved, in the way they scanned rooms, in the way they listened for sounds that others ignored. Yet among the survivors, there was also a quiet pride, not of glory, but of duty fulfilled. They knew what they had done, they knew what it had cost, and they knew that the role they had filled could not have been filled by just anyone. In later decades, historians and veterans began gathering oral accounts, recorded interviews, memoir fragments, conversations held in reunion halls and VFW posts. What emerged was not a story of fear alone, but of mastery developed under impossible conditions. Ball turret gunners spoke of learning to read the movement of clouds to spot approaching aircraft, recognizing enemy engine notes before they appeared in view, feeling the bomber's shifts and vibrations to anticipate evasive maneuvers, firing in fractional bursts to conserve ammunition for decisive moments. What seemed chaotic to an observer was, to the gunner, a practiced calculus, one part instinct, one part training, and one part survival. As decades passed, the technology that once defined the turret became outdated, then obsolete. The era of mass formation bombers ended. Jet aircraft flew faster and higher. Radar-controlled turrets replaced manual ones. Eventually, aircraft no longer require such positions at all. And so the turret remained as something else, a memory, a symbol, a reminder. A reminder that in the vast machinery of war, sometimes the most exposed position matters the most. Today, preserved B-17s and B-24s stand in aviation museums, quiet, clean, polished. Visitors peer into the ball turret and often say the same thing. Someone actually fit in there? But the veterans who stood beside those aircraft at reunions did not speak of the turret in disbelief. They touched it gently, almost with familiarity, the way a craftsman might touch the tool that once defined his skill. Some would place their hand on the metal ring and stand quietly. Others would speak softly, describing the sound of oxygen rushing through cold lines, the rhythm of the engines, the sudden flicker of sunlight off a climbing enemy fighter. And sometimes, when the moment felt right, they said the words that captured everything the turret had meant. It wasn't the worst place. It was just where I was needed. In those words lies the truth at the heart of the ball turret's legacy. It was not a place of fear alone. It was a place of responsibility, the last defense, the one position that protected the bomber at its most vulnerable point. The men who occupied it did not choose the role because it was safe, or comfortable, or heroic. They chose it, or accepted it, because someone had to. And that choice, made by thousands of young men in the skies of Europe and the Pacific, helped shape the outcome of the air war. It is here that the story of the ball turret leads naturally into its final chapter, not of machines or tactics, but of meaning. In the quiet aftermath of battle, when the engines are silent and the guns have long ceased their furious rhythm, the memory of the ball turret remains suspended in the minds of those who survived. To be a ball turret gunner was to confront the war in its rawest form. No armor of distance, no abstraction of strategy, no comfort in numbers. It was a war fought inches away from death, where courage didn't look like shouting commands or charging forward. Courage looked like stillness, like breathing slow in a space too small to move, like trusting the men above you to bring you home. The turret itself has become a symbol of the cost of air supremacy, of the unforgiving physics of altitude and steel, and of the invisible human hearts that made machines more than metal. Those who flew in that tiny glass sphere learned very quickly that the sky was not empty. It was alive with danger, purpose, and fate. And though time has carried them far from the roaring heavens they once guarded, the memory remains clear. They held the bottom of the bomber, but lifted the weight of every mission on their shoulders. Their sacrifice is not measured in victories, but in the quiet bravery of showing up, mission after mission, against impossible odds.